We turn now to some political analysis from our panel. Stephen Hayes is the editor of The Dispatch and a Fox News contributor. Margaret TALEV is the White House and politics editor at Axios. Jeffrey Goldberg is the editor-in-chief of The Atlantic, and ANTJUAN SEAWRIGHT is the Democratic strategist and CBS News contributor. Good to have you all here.
Good to be here.
Impeachment seems to be sucking the oxygen out of everything here in Washington. Stephen, I want to begin with you because I know you think that this is a bad week for Republicans, but you don't think outside the Beltway this is resonating.
I don't think it's really resonating. If you look at the way that Republicans in Congress are reacting to this, it's almost with a shrug of the shoulders. We saw these transcripts come out. If you spent time reading the 2,000 plus pages of the transcripts, tremendously damaging to the argument that Republicans have made for the past 6 weeks in defense of the president. One by one, you saw all of these defenses of the president on substance fall away, where it's clear that there was this quid pro quo that Democrats and others have been alleging. Republicans don't have an answer for it, as I think was evident in your interview with Senator Kennedy.
He said it depends on the kind of quid pro quo.
Yeah, I mean, he sketched out this scenario where he had, on the one hand, the president might have been doing this because he has some vague interest in corruption broadly. But you have to take a step back and think about what that means. I mean, this is a president who has had friendly relations with leaders of tremendously corrupt countries, whether you're talking about Egypt or Russia or Saudi Arabia or Turkey, who wants to bring troops home, who's an America firster, but he suddenly had such an interest in corruption in this one country, in Ukraine, that he sent his personal attorney to conduct investigations that happened to overlap, coincidentally, with the interests, his political interests, in that they were investigating two of his chief political rivals. It doesn't even pass the laugh test.
So, Margaret, why then is that not more clear to the public? If it's so clear, as Stephen laid out there, is it that what these public hearings will change?
Well, the public hearings can only change people's minds if people watch the public hearings and are engaged in them or read about them. And I think it's pretty clear from the early weeks of this that President Trump's base is not shaken or thwarted by this. And so really the issue is the group we're going to be hearing a lot about in the next several months, which is the suburban voters, right? These are if you call them moderate voters or swing voters or suburban voters, somewhere in that circle is this group of people. We saw the relevance of suburban voters in Virginia in the elections, perhaps to some extent in Kentucky, and this is the group that both Democrats and President Trump are now going to be fighting for, because they are the people who are engaged in, in sort of the daily business that involves paying attention to more details like this. And they are the people who are most likely to be at a workstation at work with the TV on, absorbing the contents of this, trying to figure out whether they are uncomfortable enough about it that they won't vote for President Trump twice.
ANTJUAN, how do Democrats avoid what happened with the Robert Mueller hearings, where there was this big buildup and the idea that if he testifies publicly, he'll describe in vivid detail what people didn't bother to read in print? How is this going to be different?
I think we have to first come to the realization that Donald Trump and his disciples have no interest in having a relationship with the truth, regardless of whether it's public or whether they actually read it and can see it. Number two, I think Democrats have to block and tackle, block out this arguments or this distraction that the Republicans want to draw them into, and really tackle the issues that matter to the American people, while they also pass legislation that they promised the American people in 2018 and remind people that it's the Senate is the holdup, is the problem, and everything goes to McConnell's graveyard to die. If we fail to do that, we will be sentenced again to 2 years in the hard time as the minority party.
Do you think it's going well?
It's hard to say. Look, here's what I do know. The Republicans demonstrated what I believe to be a political pump fake about transparency during this process when you had 47 or 48 members of their conference a part of these hearings. Now they're public, and you have leaders like Senator Graham and others who want to press the ignore button on the fact that they're going to be transparent. And essentially they're saying, regardless of what comes out, no matter who says it, like a decorated military official, it's not true because it's anti-Donald Trump. And we've seen this movie before, and that's why I think Democrats have to stay focused on the things that matter outside the bubble.
Jeffrey, who's actually winning on the messaging here and convincing the American public, because that's what these public hearings are going to be focused on?
I think it's actually, this sounds very journalistic, but I think it's too early to tell. We don't know what dynamic we enter when we actually see these people live in front of the cameras and how many people are watching and how convincing it is. I mean, on the one hand, we'll know the answer to that question, I think. Not so much, I mean, we'll know it when we see what people in the suburbs feel about it. We'll also really know the answer if we see Republicans become less cohesive. If there's one person with influence in the Republican Party on the Hill who says, you know what, the emperor really doesn't have his clothes on, that could sort of break this open a little bit, because all of us, I think, up here talk to Republicans on the Hill who privately say this is a disaster, a moral disaster, a political disaster, an ethical disaster, and they're just holding on and they're coming up with these talking points that you saw on your show today. But there's a belief, and maybe this is an over-optimistic belief on the part of Trump's opponents, that there are people there who will say enough is enough. When they hear it from, as you say, a decorated war veteran, this is actually what happened. When they hear it from serious professionals from the State Department, they might just say enough.
But Margaret, here's the one thing Democrats and Republicans agree on, the interests of national security. And I think if Democrats use that as their North Star or their foundation about this being about national security and the future of this country, I think that is the point that no one can argue.
Well, in the meantime, the split screen will be these hearings happening in Capitol Hill while the president is meeting with another world leader, that he is dealing with national security. I was pressing, Jeffrey, the National Security Advisor, on why Turkey's leader deserves the honor of walking into the White House. And after listing all of the things that Turkey has done wrong.
Right, and as you know, there's a hope in Washington that Erdogan leaves without having his bodyguards beat up people, as happened the last time. We have lower standards for this visit than we usually have, which is like, let's not have street violence associated with this visit. No, the reception of Erdogan this week doesn't make any sense from a national security perspective. Are you rewarding, remember, we always talk about rewarding people with an Oval Office visit. Is this the person who deserves an Oval Office visit? No, of course not, but nothing is particularly coherent in our national security strategy right now. So it makes as much sense as anything else in this kind of topsy-turvy world in which we live.
You were referring to in 2017 when American protesters were beaten up. There are U.S. Marshals arrest warrants out for some of Turkey's, the Erdogan's bodyguards.
Right.
We'll see if they show up on this visit. We'll be back in a moment with a lot more from our panel. Don't go away. And we're back with more from our political panel. Stephen, I want to start off with you. The Journal has an op-ed, and you know their op-ed pages are often thought to be fairly conservative. Sure. So when they say Bloomberg, water's warm, jump right in, to Michael Bloomberg, suggesting he get into this 2020 race and that it might be a good idea. Should Democrats be skeptical of that somewhat endorsement?
Sounds like a trick.
It is a little trick. Look, I think Democrats probably should be skeptical of Michael Bloomberg for a number of reasons, most especially because he's done this before. I mean, we've had how many head fakes from Michael Bloomberg, and he's also, you know, he was Democrat, Republican, Independent. He sort of covered the gamut. And I think you're hearing this from people like Elizabeth Warren, people like Bernie Sanders, who I think are more in touch with the sort of base of the Democratic Party, that this is not the Democratic savior that people think.
But is he the kind of candidate who could convince Republicans to cross over and vote for him?
Well, I think conceivably, I mean, he certainly has some nanny state aspects to him that I think would make conservatives uncomfortable. But I think the immediate impact is much likely to have the opposite effect, where he dilutes support potentially for Joe Biden. Mm-hmm. He could block a path forward for others who are running in the so-called moderate lane, like Buttigieg, Amy Klobuchar, and others. So I think if you're Elizabeth Warren today and you see Michael Bloomberg getting in, you're happy.
Mm-hmm. Antoine, you know, being a self-made billionaire, successful business person, you can look at that and say it's the American dream. Or you can look at that and say, this person is suspect. And it seems that this person is suspect is what we're hearing more on the campaign trail. And that isn't comfortable for everyone.
I'm not going to criticize him for making money. But let me say 4 things about Bloomberg. Number one, most people will agree that the political highway is experiencing a traffic jam because we have too many people running for president on our side, and most of the lanes are filled at this point. The second point is that it's Sunday morning, so I'll say this. There's a political scripture that I reference. It says the road to heaven and the White House runs through South Carolina. Well, he has agreed that he will not participate in the South Carolina primary, where 61% of the people who will cast their vote will be African American, 55% women. Most of the states that follow reflect South Carolina. South Carolina was a launch pad for Barack Obama and a safe haven for Hillary Clinton.
Also your home state.
Oh, God's country. And then the third thing, it is the home of the most prominent and powerful African American in the U.S. Congress, Jim Clyburn. And so what Bloomberg is saying by not participating in the South Carolina primary, if he gets in, is that I have no interest in what majority of African Americans think in the South, and especially the home of Whip Jim Clyburn. That's where I think he's making a mistake, and I call it the highest act of malpractice any campaign can commit.
Wow. Margaret.
Well, I mean, there are a lot of reasons why a bid would be complicated, and I think we're not sure yet that he is going to run. There was no way to secretly check the box in Alabama without people finding out. But the case to be made, if he did pursue it, is that what he's done with his billions of dollars is invest in two of the most important issues to Democrats on climate change and on gun control, right? That he's got support in Wall Street, he's got some support in Silicon Valley as well, and that when you look at the results of last Tuesday's election, there may be a market of people in the general election, maybe, that would be receptive to a message like his. But you know, there is also an overarching lesson from the 2016 race, which is that when you have a 17-way or an 18-way or a 19-way primary, somebody who did not have a chance in a 3-way race could have a chance, and that is all part of the calculus.
You cannot be the Democratic nominee without having strong, across-the-board, broad, deep, and wide support among African-American voters. He does not have that.
Jeffrey.
But I do want to say one thing in his defense, or in the theoretical defense of this candidacy. Unlike the other billionaires who are really vanity candidates, this is a proven election winner. I mean, this is a 3-time mayor of New York City.
As a Democrat, Republican, and Independent.
I mean, he's covered all the bases. I mean, so he has overcome a first hurdle. He's actually gone before voters and gotten votes, and by many accounts, had had a largely successful run as mayor. So I think it does put him in a slightly different lane than just the pure vanity billionaire fast lane.
But it is the Biden lane,
Right.
and it complicates that contest inextricably.
All right. Thanks to all of you for the analysis.